All right, we've got another Deneb video today. This one is a follow-up to last week's Guy in a Cube live stream, where someone was asking about the ability to dynamically size text in a Power BI visual. They thought it probably would be possible with the Deneb visual. It is, and I'm going to go through a few ways you can do that today. As always, if these videos are helping you out, please go ahead and like and subscribe. People coming from other visualization products quickly hit a limitation when they try to add text labels, even static ones, to their visual, let alone dynamic ones. But this is pretty straightforward to do with the Deneb visual, the Charticulator visual, and I should have listed the Plotly.js visual here as well. And I'm going to show you 4 techniques in this video on how you could deal with text strings of varying length on your text labels. And you can use one at a time, or you can mix and match as needed, whatever your use case is. And I want to give a big thank you to Patty Swank, a friend and former colleague, who is also a big fan of the Deneb visual, for sharing some of her tips that I'll use in this video too. I'm going to do this a little backwards. I'm sort of going to start with the near complete visual and then just show you the text tips. And then a second video, if there's interest, I'll go ahead and do the complete build of the visual that I've shown. It's a pretty straightforward stack bar chart, but there are a few tips that I think people would appreciate. Let's get to the demo. So, and one thing about this, it does take sometimes for the initial render for it to come up. But this is sort of the starting visual. And so it looks pretty good. And let me just quickly explain the data set that we're working with here. I just got from online the list of the NASDAQ 100 companies, including what sector they're in, their market cap, and that's all I'm using in this. And then I also, just to add some color by field to the chart, I created this own column. In fact, I did it in Power Query, but I'll just show you the DAX equivalent here. I didn't end up using this one, but it's the same logic, but on the Power Query side, where I wanted 2 different values here, whether that stock is in a given portfolio or not, but I didn't want it to be a 50-50 split. So I just used this technique that, I said, if a random number is greater than or equal to 0.7, right? Yes, otherwise no. And so that gets me about, 30% of the stock will be in the portfolio approximately. All right. So here's the starting visual, and you might say, hey, could I make this with the Power BI native visuals? So let's take a look at that. I spent very little time on this, but the bottom line is you can't do it with the native stacked bar chart visual. And I looked in AppSource and really didn't see one that had text labels. If there is one out there, please put it in the comments because I'd like to know about it. But this one here is, and it doesn't look very good. I've got the sector across the bottom. I had to use the legend of the company name to get it to break up into different things, but then they each got their own color. And then I've got a legend over here, which would not be very readable. And if I go and I turn on data labels, I have the option, I have just a simple measure here of a constant 1 where it just equals the value 1, just to give everything the same height, because I just want to see, how many stocks basically in the 100 are in each sector, and that's the sole purpose of this chart. So I can display the value there, but there's not an option here like an FX button to put text there. So that's where I need the Deneb or Charticulator or Plotly.js to do that. Okay. And this looks pretty good. We're pretty close. But if you notice, some of these companies, if I hover, I can see the tooltip, have pretty long names, right? And it's white text, so they are here, but they're going outside the visual and you can't see them. And some are overlapping with each other, so it doesn't look good at all. So we need to deal with that somehow. Now, certainly you could do some more data prep and maybe abbreviate them and use the abbreviated names in there. That would be a fine technique as well, but there's some ways you can do it dynamically. So let's talk about those. So the first one I'll show, I just calling it dynamic truncation. And probably because I'm recording this taking extra long to pop up. but it does take a bit. And so with this one, we've got the visual here, we've got our sector, we've got the company, and the in portfolio is the, is it in the portfolio, yes or no? And so what we can do to add truncation here, and one of the nice things about the Deneb is sometimes you can handle it in with the Vega Lite syntax, or you can just write a measure that deals with your logic and then just pass that calculated value in and let Deneb use it. And you may see me use both today, but it is a nice option to have. So if I take this first one here, where I'm doing truncation, if you look at this, I'm basically harvesting the company value by just taking the min of the company. So it's just single row and inside each box here. And then I'm just checking if the length of that is greater than 10, then truncate it to 10. Otherwise, and add ... otherwise just use the value. Okay, so if we put that into the visual, and then we go in and edit the visual, and one of the nice things you can do too is just click on, again, I won't go through this whole thing, but in the other video, I'll go through the full build on this. But basically, we're using the company field in a couple places. One, just to get the count of one to give everything the same height. I'm doing the aggregation count on that field for my y-axis value. And I'll explain in the other video why I had to use stack and all that. I could have also just used that constant one measure I showed a bit ago to give me that. And one of the other visuals, I actually needed to do that. So I'll show you that. But then we're also using the company value here in the mark for the text. There's two elements here that are layered. One is the bar itself, and then the other is the text that goes over it. And so that's where we're using it. So I could go through and manually change this to be the name of that measure, that truncation static, or I can just come here to the field mapping, and so basically it says wherever you're using the company value, just use that truncation static value. And then if we apply that, well, it was already there, and we go back, you can see that the longer names are now truncated, and this looks a lot better already, right? And so that may be good. And you can still show the whole value in the tooltip. I'll show that in one of the other ones. You can actually specify which field. So in a different visual, I'll show you how to actually have the company name show up here. But so let me show you how to, right now, if I hover, the default is it just shows the fields that are in the tooltip that are used in the encoding, but we can actually affect that to do other fields that we want there. So if we go back into edit, right, and down here I've got tooltip equals true, okay, and what it defaults to, and let me just, for the sake of time, let me copy and paste this in. This is what it defaults to. It says content encoding, right? So that's what you're seeing now. If I just do content data and apply that, when I hover, you'll actually see all the fields in the visual. Okay, and there's some that Deneb is doing behind the scenes. Actually, it didn't do them all. But it did more than it did. But the way to really customize it to get what you want is, and notice that this is in the mark encoding. If I get rid of this here, because this, to do this, you actually have to do this in the encoding part. Let me be this, and then put it down in the encoding. Put it after the color. And so you can actually do tooltip and then pass it an array of fields to show what you want there. So if I do this, then I hover, I can get just the fields that I specified. So that's a good tip for you there, is to really customize your tooltips. And so now, even though it's truncated in the visual, I can see the full name when I hover. All right. And so similarly, instead of the truncation static, I also could do this other measure, truncation dynamic. And so what this one does, so I get that same experience, and this time I'll do truncation dynamic, apply the mapping. Okay. And so what this one does is, let me go back to the report. And if you look at this measure, it's actually checking two things. It's not only looking at the length of the company name, but it's also looking at how many sectors are selected in the visual. Because if you have fewer sectors, obviously the bars are going to be wider and you're going to have more space. And so basically, if there's 5 or fewer sectors, I can go for a longer length before I add the ... than before. So to see what that looks like, and again, I'm just showing you the basic techniques. You could dial these in and do a whole lot more. But if I just say retail and technology, I pick 4. Now it's actually keeping 20 characters before it truncates. And obviously on these, there's even more room. I could have gone with a higher number, but I'm just showing you the basic technique. Okay. All right. So that's dynamic truncation. Now let's talk about dynamic sizing. So in each of these, I'm starting with that native visual, and some of these I've already done it, so I'll just go in and show you. So in this case, I've built the visual with, again, the sector across the bottom, company, still coloring by in portfolio. In this case, I'm using the constant 1 instead of doing that aggregation count for the Y encoding. I'm just using the constant value of 1 to make this chart. And it turns out I needed to do that on this one. I'm not fully sure why, but once I switched to this approach, I was able to, I wasn't having any issues with doing the custom or the dynamic font size. So in this case, I've got this measure where I'm just passing in different values, again, considering the length of the company and the number of sectors selected, my y-axis or x-axis values. And basically, I have two true/false type variables here, where I'm saying, are there few sectors, yes or no, and is the name short, yes or no. And then I basically cover the 4 scenarios where I have, a low number of sectors and a short name, in which case it can be the longest. If it's not a short name, it makes the text smaller, and then the default is small if there are all the or a lot of sectors, and the name is long. Okay, so just to see, and so you can see the result in the visual, right, where some of these are bigger because their name is short. And then if I go and just select a few sectors, right, you can see the font size is even bigger, right? And so again, this doesn't look awesome. You could dial it in. You could also do a more dynamic formula and get pretty granular with the sizes, like, come up with a multiplication factor to actually calculate a font size based on the length of the string. Mine, I did it sort of in steps. But you have because you can use a measure, you can get very creative with how you come up with your font size, and then it's straightforward to use it in the visual. Okay. And just to go in there, just to show you where that's used. Again, it's the same basic visual. And then in the mark property for the text mark, we've got this expression here, and I'm just referencing that measure here. Now, when I like to use this to format and apply what I've done, I usually write it like this, but sometimes it auto corrects it to this syntax, but they're equivalent, right? So you can also write it like that, and it's the same visual, but sometimes you may see it change to the syntax. It doesn't matter. Okay. Then, yeah, I think that's it on this one. Okay, so that was a relatively small change. You make the measure, put it in there, add this to your mark properties, and again, you have to use this expr, this expression, and then datum is how you reference basically the value on the current row. A lot of these you could do either in a mark with an expression like this with datum dot, or you can do it in an encoding. Sometimes you can do it in either place or only one place. But where I can do it in both, I tend to use this. It just seems a little simpler to me. Okay. All right. So that is dynamic sizing. I just did that, changing the syntax there, and it doesn't matter. So I'll just take that. All right. So that's dynamic sizing. And then the last one is text wrapping. Okay. So in this case, I've modified the visual, and I basically selected the lower height sectors here. I got rid of some of the tall ones, and I did that so that some of these ended up being taller, right? So again, in your scenario, you may have something like this. And so this is what it might look like with a text wrap. And you can see it isn't perfect. Again, you could dial this in further. This one, has 4 lines, so it overlaps with the bar below it. But overall, this looks pretty good and may be closer to the look you're going for. And just to show you how this one looks, there isn't actually an extra measure here. It's still the original 3 fields. I originally thought that I'd be able to do a measure like this, where I could do like a substitute, and wherever it found a space, I could put in the 10 unit chart 10, which is the carriage return. And then the Deneb visual would recognize that in it. And it turns out that's not the case. But there is a way to do it. So let me show you how to do that. And so in this case, again, I'm adding something to the text mark. And for the text property of the text mark, I'm using another expression. And it's possible to actually pass an array of text strings to it, and that's how you wrap stuff. And so in this case, I'm saying, hey, take the value on the current row for the company field and split it, and in single quotes with just a space in between, and that creates an array of text strings. And then that's what makes them show up as wrap text. I'll show it in the other video, but I also use that similar technique to come up with the wrapping on the x-axis as well. So I had these angled, but they were going out further, and I could use this same thing in the label expression property of the x-axis to split. Again, in this case, you don't reference the field name, you just reference the label for the current row, and again split it at the space, and it's the same technique basically, but with label instead of sector, which is the field name. All right, so that's text wrapping. Again, you can combine that with the other techniques as well. All right, and then the last one I wanted to show, I just referred to as dynamic hiding, because you say this is nice. They all have the same height, and this is great for things like, I want to show my projects and in which phase, or a scenario like this where which ones are just in each bucket, just to visualize how things are distributed. But say you wanted to say, no, I wanted to also reflect the market cap. So I want to have a y-axis value here, and see which ones have the highest market cap, and then which companies have the biggest portion in that sector, for example. So in this case, you can see that if you do apply, if you see the fields that are in here, I do have a measure here called market cap NB. And that's just basically, dividing the market cap value by a billion, just so that it was more convenient on the tooltip to show that instead of all the decimal, all the digits. But you can see some of these would be very small, and so I can still show them in the tooltip, but trying to put text there, it would not be readable. So I just decided to hide it. And so there's a couple ways you can do that. You can do it in the encoding, but you can also do it in the text property as well. And so again, you could do it with a measure, or you could do it with a condition. And I'll show you the measure one first. So if we just look at this show hide measure, basically it's saying, hey, take my, this is just the that measure I just showed you, and if it's more than 200 billion, then I want it to show, I want it to have an opacity of 1, and if it doesn't, I want it to be 0. And I just use that measure here as well, and then I dynamically hide and show. Okay. The other way to do it would be to write an expression like this, where I'd say datum dot market cap in billions is greater than 200 question mark, and then I'd go 1 colon 0. Right, and let's see, let's confirm that works for us. Oops, I put it in the wrong spot. Paste that there. And I put the company value back there. That shows you 2 ways to do it. Again, it's probably simpler to just write the measure because people are probably more familiar with DAX like this. But there is syntax within Vega Lite that you can read about in the documentation that allows you to do an if statement basically with this syntax here, where I'm comparing the value, and then if that's true, that's, the question is, is this true or false? And then it gives you the true result and the false result. Okay. All right. So that's dynamic hiding. And those are the different techniques I wanted to show today. And again, if there's interest, or I may just do it anyway, make a second video to actually show you how I came up with this starting visual. Because again, I do think this is a visual that could be used in a lot of industries, and might be a common limitation people hit when they're first evaluating Power BI.